welcome to the launch of the 2020 Challenges Annual Forum Recommendations, kindly hosted by the permanent missions of Norway and Indonesia to the UN in New York. My name is Benoit Piliser, and I'm with the Challenges Forum. We are a global partnership composed of 50 organizations from 24 countries, shaping the debate on more effective peace operations. Our forum provides an impartial and informal platform for policy dialogue on peace operations. This year, we celebrate the 25th anniversary of our forum. I am pleased that today we have over 180 registrants coming from over 60 permanent representations, the UN, both HQ and field missions, as well as partner organizations. In terms of our program today, we will start with opening remarks by Norway and Indonesia, followed by a moderated discussion in which we will zoom in on some of the recommendations for revitalizing UN peace operations and where you, as participants, will have a possibility to ask questions. We only have 1 hour, so please respect the allocated time and keep your interventions as brief as possible. Lastly, please be informed that the entire session will be recorded. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Mona Juul, permanent representative of Norway to the UN in New York, for opening remarks. Ambassador Juul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and a very good morning to all of you from New York. It is a pleasure to join you all here at the virtual launch of the recommendation from the Challenges Forum. We are pleased to host this event together with our good friends at the Indonesian mission to the UN, who are, of course, key players in peace operations. Norway's commitment to UN peacekeeping goes back to its first days. And as current member of the Security Council, we are especially receptive to new ideas to help peace operations succeed. So I will frame my comments this morning around the key themes of the 2020 Challenges Forum. First, and maybe most important, utilizing the full spectrum of peace operations and the primacy of politics. Norway strongly believes that missions should be designed based on the needs on the ground. And we must ensure that UN assistance to countries emerging from conflict is not restrained by budgetary rigidities. Colleagues, it is also no accident that the primacy of politics and finding political solutions to conflicts were identified as priority areas for the Action of Peacekeeping Initiative, A4P. We are very conscious of the need for the Security Council to be more effective in developing structured peacekeeping mandates. Second, on the UN-AU partnership, Norway fully agrees that this partnership is key to the success of peace operations in Africa. And as noted in the recommendation, regional economic communities must also be included. We see great merit in early dialogue between the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council when situations of concern develop. Clearly, this is relevant also if adapted for other regions. Third, on peace building and sustaining peace. Norway supports the recommendation that operation needs to better respond and engage with host communities and state institutions to phase out successfully. Importantly, this cannot be done without the full, equal, and meaningful inclusion of women. Fourth and finally, on performance and effectiveness. Norway agrees that an understanding of the factors that make peace operation effective is critical to strengthening missions' performance. This is why we actively support the development of the comprehensive performance assistance system. We recognize the importance of developing tools to assess the whole effect in conflict-affected countries, and we encourage the representatives of research community to take on this challenge in their work. Colleagues, we are fully behind the mission of the Challenges Forum to generate innovative ideas and to promote results to maintain the relevance of UN peace operation in a challenging global landscape. This is why we see great value to our discussion today, and I encourage you all to draw inspiration from the presentation in today's important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those kind and encouraging words. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Pangeran Ibrani, Minister Counsellor at the Permanent Mission of Indonesia to the UN in New York, on behalf of Ambassador Koba. Mr. Ibrani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have the honor to deliver this remark on behalf of our Chargé d'Affaires, Ambassador Muhammad Koba, who unfortunately can't join today's event this morning. Indonesian Mission is pleased to partner with the Norwegian Mission and the Challenges Forum to host this virtual event to launch and share the recommendations of the Challenges Annual Forum 2020. As you are all aware, the forum focused on key topics on primacy of politics, a UN partnership, peace building and sustaining peace, and peacekeeping performance. Those are very pertinent topics, particularly in the context of the current challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemics. As we know, the pandemic has affected the work of peacekeeping operation in implementing its mandate and the safety and security of peacekeepers on the ground. For Indonesia, peacekeeping operation is obviously very close to us. We are proud to be a long-standing and consistent contributor of peacekeeping operations. Our participation dates back since 1957, and since then we have deployed more than 45,000 peacekeepers. Currently, we are one of the largest TPCCs with around 2,800 peacekeepers, including 188 women personnel serving in 8 missions. Despite the challenges faced by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are committed to continuing our contribution to peacekeeping operation. As a major troop and police contributing country, Indonesia is strongly committed to make peacekeeping more effective and fit for purpose. We are a strong supporter of the Action for Peacekeeping Operation, A4P. We also welcome the recently launched A4P Plus as an approach or strategy to accelerate the implementation of the 8 priorities under the A4P. I would like to underline the importance of close partnership among all stakeholders, including the Secretariat, peacekeeping missions, TPCCs, host countries, Security Council members, and C34 members to share the responsibility in making peacekeeping operation more effective. For our part, we have been consistent in advocating training and capacity building to improve the performance of peacekeeping operations. We believe that with better training, peacekeepers are better equipped to perform their duties more effectively and to improve the performance of the missions. That's why when we were the member of the Security Council in May 2019, we initiated a presidential statement on training and capacity building, which is the first outcome of the Council on this issue. Increasing women participation in peacekeeping is also one of our priorities. We believe that women peacekeepers make a significant contribution to enhance the overall performance of peacekeeping. Last year, Indonesia initiated the Security Council Resolution 2538, which is the first resolution focusing on women in peacekeeping operations. Another key topic that is very important to Indonesia is the safety and security of peacekeepers. As peacekeepers are now operating in more dangerous environment, we call for greater efforts to ensure their safety and security. In this regard, last month, Indonesia, together with China, Brazil, and Rwanda, established the Group of Friends on the Safety and Security of UN Peacekeepers as an informal platform to support the collective efforts to address this very important issue. To conclude, I hope that today's discussion could contribute to our efforts to strengthen the effectiveness of peacekeeping operations. In particular, I also hope that the recommendations of the Challenges Annual Forum could also serve as inputs for further deliberations at the Security Council and C34. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ibrani. And thank you as well to both of you for respecting the allocated time, which is much appreciated. Ambassador Juul, we understand that you need to move to other obligations, but let me thank you, Norway and Indonesia, for your support in organizing this event, in hosting this event, and of course as well in all the support that we have received as well in organizing last year's annual forum, which is very much appreciated. So I wish you all the best and see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you. Good. I would like now to move on to our moderated discussion on the key recommendations and their relevance really to peace operations and ongoing processes in New York. As participants, please submit your questions in writing through the Q&A function at the bottom of your page. Our panelists today are Mr. Soemirat, Director for International Security and Disarmament at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, Cedric de Coning, Research Professor at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, Fonteh Akum, Executive Director at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa, and David Haeri, Director of the Division for Policy, Evaluation and Training at the UN Department for Peace Operations. The discussion today will be moderated by Lisa Charland, head of the international programs at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And Lisa, of course, is also the author of our annual forum report. And with this, I hand over the floor to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Benoit. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants that are joining us for this conversation today. When the Virtual Challenges Forum took place last year in December 2020, peace operations had been confronted with a series of challenges, not the least of which was managing the ongoing deployment of personnel and their efforts to implement mandates throughout a pandemic that was taking place. And this was certainly one of the themes that came out of the discussion. One of the points that was highlighted by the participants last year was certainly that the strengths of peace operations, I think, really emerged from the ability for business continuity in terms of what was taking place. What I'd like to do with this session is I have a couple of questions that I want to direct to each of our panelists that we have today, who are representing the UN and the co-hosts of the Virtual Challenges Forum from 2020. And then we'll open up to the questions that are coming from the audience today. So I might start with my first question, and Roy, I might direct this one at you, given Indonesia's work in leading the dialogue strand that was looking at the topic of peace building and sustaining peace. One of the recommendations that emerged from the forum was the importance of peace operations fostering a national dialogue and good governance initiatives with a focus on harmonising people-centred approaches and state-centric approaches. I want to focus a little bit on what we mean by people-centred approaches and ask you, how do we foster people-centred approaches in peace operations? And importantly, one of the points that I think was made during these discussions was the need to shift mindsets of stakeholders in this regard. So I might throw that question to you to start off our conversation as part of this discussion.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues, since I have to assume that some of you are also staying in the evening part of the world, just like me. Thank you very much, Lisa, for the introductory remarks. First of all, of course, congratulations to Challenges Forum for the successful annual event last year. It was a pleasure for me to represent Indonesia, co-hosting the event with our colleague from Norway and South Africa. And of course, it was such an honor for me to chair one of the dialogue strands connecting to peace building and sustaining peace in the peace operations. Before I continue, I will encourage colleague to later on after the event finish, or if you have time, you can still try to go into detail and examining all documentations related to the event, including what you could pay attention to the issues, the big issues discussed in each dialogue strands, and also key recommendations coming from each dialogue strands, because anyway it is interlinked, intertwined, and it has what you call a connection from one to another. But with regard to your question, it is true that one of the recommendations coming from dialogue strand that I chaired is about foster a national dialogue and good governance initiative. Very, very dear and very near to all of us. Let me start by emphasizing that peace operation itself, of course, cannot and should not work alone and cannot work in silo. There's one thing for sure. It needs support from local agencies, including NGOs and UN country team on the ground, as well as from local communities. And in this regard, of course, the keywords, maybe if I may say, is the synergy and the complementary of roles when we are talking about how we want everybody to work in tandem. And during the discussion in the dialogue strand 2, we underline, I think there is some kind of general agreement that there is a need to balance the state-centric and people-centric approach. And in order to achieve this particular balance, the UN need to be, how do I say it, more adept in responding to people on the ground. But of course, at the same time, of course, it's not easy. The UN has to be able to support host countries' institutions. And of course, in this regard, we are talking about the mindset that peace operation have to engage in a top-down approach and need to be supported by bottom-up engagement. So I think that one of the main message coming. And to become more people-centered, if we are asking ourselves how, I think peace operation do not necessarily require new mandates or policies or even additional resources. Big elephant in the room when we are talking about resources. But of course, it requires a shift of mindset. This shift should be done at all levels, in terms of leadership level, to influence international changes or institutional, organizational changes itself. So the peace operations should also invest their time to build strategic alliance with local and national actors. So this is the shift that we need to push. And another element maybe that very important and come up quite frequent during the discussion is the need of community engagement through community policing. And coming from Indonesian delegations, we are very, what do you call it, very supportive to the issue of community engagement. And this method would assist peace operation to recognize the different needs and requirements of various communities, particularly the marginalized and overlooked in the peace process. And of course, maybe when we are talking about this particular rubric, one of the components that need to be highlighted a little bit more is the police component that we believe can share experience of this kind of engagement model, since they have a particular expertise in this field. So lastly, maybe I can also highlight some of the measures that need to be taken into consideration. First, we need to identify the relevant local actors to ensure analysis from the start that it is people-centered oriented from the beginning. And then the second one, we need to encourage further consultation between UN country team and local representative to put people at the center of the discussions. So not only in the start, but also during the discussion. And lastly, we need to encourage the UN Security Council to take field trips. Small things, but very important in order to get better understanding the situation on the ground, including, of course, we hope the UN Security Council mission can have the opportunity to interact with local communities. So handing over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roy, for those insights. And I think that echoes a lot of the themes that you alluded to that came out of those conversations there about the importance of engaging with local and national actors. And I think the importance of bridging perhaps that sort of divide to some extent between the discussions in New York and the Security Council and local actors on the ground in the field. So that was a really great oversight, I think, to kick off our discussion of one of the dialogue strands that took place. What I'd like to do now is move to one of the other conversations that took place in a dialogue strand that was focused on the performance and effectiveness of peace operations. And I'll turn to you, Cedric, here in terms of some of the recommendations that came out of that conversation that took place. We know that there's been quite a focus on peace operations in recent years, looking at the delivery and performance of them in the field. And in some ways, this has been driven in part by the political pressure of member states who are really looking at effectiveness in terms of reducing costs of UN peacekeeping. In many ways, we've also seen this because of the length of some of the peacekeeping operations that are deployed and how we look at how are we assessing their effectiveness if they've been on the ground in some instances for several decades. And part of this discussion was also looking at what the UN has been doing, particularly around the comprehensive performance assessment system, which is being utilised by a number of peace operations to assess effectiveness in the field using a measure of indicators and looking at different mandate requirements. I want to ask you, how do we ensure that some of the data that's being gathered sort of taken from the CPAS system, for instance, and some of the data and research that's being undertaken perhaps by research organisations or think tanks, how do we ensure that this information that's being gathered is getting to the right people and informing those who are in a position to be making decisions, particularly at the strategic level, about peace operations, whether it be in mandates or in other areas of influence? So I'll direct that question to you and hand over to you to give us a bit of insight into some of the work that you've been engaged in there and what came out of those discussions.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and it's really nice to be with the Challenges Forum family in this presentation of our results of our last annual conference. I think it's actually very interesting to see how the information that is being generated by various forms of assessments and strategic reviews and so forth, filter into the decision-making process. I mean, one can look at the mission level, where of course CPAS plays a critical role in generating information for regular decision-making points, in some of the missions on a quarterly basis, where this information is presented to the leadership and where they can use it to make decisions about how to adapt their plans and approaches and their priorities in terms of responding to changing circumstances. And we probably saw this best in response to this major disruption that COVID-19 has caused, that you mentioned also earlier. And I was really incredibly impressed by how the peace operations systems, both at mission level and at headquarters, were able to adapt to this major global disruption that affected all of the different peace operations. So there's that level of decision making and information that flows at the mission level, but then through other forms of information, it could be the kind of research we undertake as research institutions. For instance, the reports we produce through the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, or it could be through the strategic reviews that is commissioned these days quite frequently by the Security Council or by the Secretary General, and that is then presented to the Security Council, and in that process informs the mission, informs the Secretariat, informs police and troop contributing countries, and informs the member states that have to make decisions at the Security Council. So I think this kind of information, this feedback that is generated through systems like CPAS, but also through research and also through the reviews, we can see how that informs decision-making at all these different scales. And I think there's a number of other elements there that is quite interesting. I think the kind of red team concept that the United Nations is also using to help assess the validity and the breadth and scope of the reviews by involving experts and researchers to comment on the strategic reviews before they are finalized is another very good system of generating a kind of a peer review, if I can use that word, for seeing that many of us are from the research community. So I think these reflect a number of ways in which the UN system, and particularly the Secretariat and the missions, have really taken on a much more systematic and I think serious and professional approach to measuring the performance of peace operations and using that knowledge to try and improve and adapt how these peace operations function. Thank you. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I think there's some interesting insights there in terms of how these different communities work and influence these processes, with each playing different complementary roles as part of those partnerships. I'd like to move on to the third conversation that was taking place as part of the dialogue strand discussions. And this one was looking at the African Union-UN partnership that we see in peace operations. And as has been alluded to in earlier parts of the conversation already, this has really been core to the way that peace operations have been carried out, particularly on the African continent over the last few decades. I might throw this question to you, Fonteh, in the context that this was the dialogue strand that ISS was engaged in leading as part of the Challenges Forum. And one of the recommendations that emerged out of those discussions, which I actually think is really timely at the moment, was about the role of the A3 in the Security Council when it comes to advancing common African positions. This has often largely been an informal arrangement, although we're increasingly seeing the A3 and even the A3 Plus releasing, of course, joint statements and engaging on different issues, both in terms of peace operations, but also more broadly in terms of the Council's agenda. So I would like to throw a question to you and ask, how can the A3 enhance the relationship between the African Union, regional economic communities, and the UN? And I would really welcome your insights on that particular question, because I think that there's a lot of people, I think, who are interested in how perhaps we can leverage some of these mechanisms to strengthen that partnership.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and it's a pleasure as well to be part of this discussion around the recommendations, particularly along the strand 1 of discussions on AU-UN partnerships in peace operations. I think the context within which we are at the moment, continuing to meet virtually against the backdrop of COVID-19, actually highlights the imperative to look at ongoing peace operations, but also to think about the future of peace operations, particularly on the importance of the A3 in contributing to these processes. Future crises obviously would be exacerbated by climate dynamics as well, the geographies of violence, which are taking place on the margins, territorial margins of most states, with cross-border implications and interregional implications. The very nature of this contextual shift in conflict dynamics indicate the necessity to connect different scales of intervention and to understand ways in which the institutional frameworks, and I'll go back to Roy's point about shifting mindsets, but pushing it a little further, shifting practices as well. What the A3 brings to the table at the UN is a direct connection to the AU Peace and Security Council as well, and to the regional economic communities, given that peace and security on the continent is regulated through the principles of subsidiarity, which basically put regional economic communities on the continent on the front lines as first responders to most of the crises that emerge. So given this particular dynamics, the A3 comes with the capacity to mutualize efforts and to harmonize the priorities from the level of AU member states, which are also United Nations member states, to the level of the regional economic communities to which all of these member states belong, which could have a role to play in peace support operations and peace operations, and to the level of the African Union as well, on 3 levels. The first one is in understanding the very nature of the crisis and how to adapt responses, particularly in peace operations, to these challenges. The second is to share the burden of responsibility in responses as well. A burden which I think the African Union is more than prepared to share as well, if the requisite financial instruments are basically put in place to support them. So it might not necessarily be about resources, but the resources are equally necessary at the level of the African Union to respond to these issues. And I think that in relation to the specific recommendations as well, I think the statement that was made by Ambassador Juul earlier on the primacy of politics was really important, because we could go ahead with peace operations the way they are at the moment, but we need to align political priorities across these different levels, from the regional economic communities through the African Union and to the United Nations Security Council level as well. And finally, we need to create synergies in action across the board. They cannot necessarily not be working at cross purposes as well. And the interrelated intersectionality between all of these actors would be able to foster not only the A3's role at the UN Security Council, but in concert with the E10 members as well, which are the non-permanent members. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Fonteh. I'd like to move to you, David, in terms of perhaps providing some reflections on what's underway within the UN at the moment when it comes to some of the issues that we've touched upon that came out of the Challenges Forum recommendations. We know, for instance, that Actions for Peacekeeping has now sort of hit the 3-year milestone, and that there's a focus on A4P+, and that there have been ongoing discussions around reforms around what a spectrum of peace operations looks like and sort of the different footprints that missions may have in the field. So I thought it might be interesting to get your assessment of a few of these issues and perhaps some of the reforms that are underway within the Secretariat to take forward either some of these ideas or things that may already be in progress at the moment.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much to Norway and Indonesia also for hosting us, and for Challenges for inviting us to this really important conversation. And I must say, looking at all of you and the participant list, it's really very nice to see so many colleagues and friends, and I hope you're all doing well as we're entering this second year of managing the pandemic roller coaster. In terms of your question, Lisa, on A4P+, I think a couple of points are important. One is that the Action for Peacekeeping initiative and the framework that it laid out is still very much in effect. The Declaration of Mutual Commitments, which member states and other partner organizations signed up to, with its key areas of focus, whether on protection, peace building, women, peace and security, etc., remain the framework. But after, as you said, after nearly 3 years of having that in place, and we think we've made some good progress on a number of areas, some of which have been touched upon, such as performance, as Cedric has said, or women, peace and security. I think the leadership of the department definitely felt that there was a need to reinvigorate it, to ensure that there was a stock taking of what has worked and what may need more effort, and hence the A4P+, with its identification of some key cross-cutting areas, areas which we think if we progress in, we will energize and see success across the whole agenda. But if we don't, they are weak points which will cause the whole agenda to flag and suffer. And a number of those areas in A4P+ have naturally, I think, and rightly been flagged already in the discussion. One is, of course, ensuring coherence behind an effective political strategy, as Fonteh was just saying, making sure that all the components of a mission are working closely behind a strategy. And the CPAS, which Cedric was talking about, asks the whole mission to come together around an integrated plan, and then measure the effect it's having as a mission in an integrated way on the impacts it's seeing on the country. So the second is strategic and operational integration, and really working to ensure that. Sometimes when we talk about integration, we're talking about the very important issue of how a UN mission integrates with the country team, and that remains important. But in this case, in A4P+, we're really asking, with multidimensional missions in particular, how do the civilian, military, police elements come together? Thirdly, continuing to work with all the partners to make sure we have the right capabilities and mindsets through ensuring training, identifying capability gaps, reaching out to TCCs and PCCs in advance, working with them to verify their level of capability, making sure that those capabilities are there. And the ministerial process that will be leading up to the ministerial meeting on peacekeeping in Seoul, in Korea, Republic of Korea, in December, will be presaged by a number of preparatory meetings on various aspects of this question of capabilities that we need, partnerships that we need, and a number of member states will also co-host these ministerial meetings. So we'll have a good chance in this year to really make sure that we are continuing to address that. Some key areas which we've identified would be, for example, in building up our ability in situational awareness, in strategic communications, and peacekeeping intelligence, for example. Fourthly, delivering accountability for our peacekeepers. We continue to come under attack and lose peacekeepers, too many. One peacekeeper is killed is too many, and we need to look at situations such as in CAR, Mali, about how to bring accountability to those who attack peacekeepers. Fifthly, upholding the accountability of peacekeepers, and this relates, of course, to conduct and discipline and sexual exploitation and abuse, but we also want to hold peacekeeping missions accountable for their environmental footprint and ensure that their climate impact is minimized, and that also minimizes risk to host populations and societies. Sixth, focusing on strategic communications. This aspect of our work needs to catch up to the reality of today, as we're seeing across all manner of political work. The problem of misinformation and disinformation, our missions are becoming direct targets of this. Getting out in front and engaging. And this is also linked, of course, to the question of more people-centered approaches, communicating better, engaging more strategically with people, and using, in fact, technology, which is often, in terms of 3, 4, and 5G connectedness, reaching quite deep into the field, making sure that we're using these technologies, not just to communicate, but to consult and draw views of people, in addition, of course, to face-to-face and local level community engagement. And finally, the question of maintaining strategic and constructive engagement with our host countries, which I think, as has been mentioned by Roy, includes both at the top level, at the strategic table, the parties to the conflict, the host government, but because we're often in places where the very question of government is at issue, hence there is a conflict, one has to engage at many levels, and I agree with Roy at this, and try also to engage with the local population so that their participation in the transition from conflict to peace also builds confidence in that peace and confidence in the idea of a new social contract coming out of conflict. So those are some of the priorities which we intend to focus on, but all of them in a way energize the entire agenda and of course resonate with the discussion strands today in challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I think you've highlighted there many of the complementarities with the reform initiatives that are underway and the discussions that were taking place last year. We've had a few questions that have come in from participants. So I'd like to direct these back to our panelists based on some of the discussions. And I would kindly ask the panelists to keep their responses limited to 1 to 2 minutes so that we can ensure that we get through the questions that have come in. I might start, there is a question that has come in relation to the implementation of women, peace and security. And of course, this was a cross-cutting theme that was discussed throughout the Challenges Forum last year in a number of different dimensions. And in particular, this question has asked about what tools and methods could be employed by the UN to ensure that the diverse needs of women are reflected upon and catered to, in particular during transitions. So I'm happy to throw that to the panelists, but I might start with you, Roy, in terms of some of the work that Indonesia's been engaged in. There was mention there by your colleague from the permanent mission about the work that Indonesia was engaged in last year on the Security Council around some of these issues. And I think this relates back to some of the conversations around engaging local actors. So I'd welcome your thoughts and reflections on that question in terms of how do we ensure that, I guess, women's diverse voices are being taken into account as part of the work that's happening with transitions in peace operations at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much for the very pertinent questions. Of course, this I agree with you. This particular issue of women, peace, and security related topics are practically discussed among several dialogue strands during the event last year. But if I may reflect a little bit, maybe in a more national capacity as Indonesian, the key for us is always about thinking it as a comprehensive package. I mean, the issue of women, peace, and security, for example, is already there for what? I mean, it's already 20 years discussed in the UN, but it is quite, what do you call it? Stunning that we just realized that there hasn't any resolution up to last year August that dedicated solely to the issue of the role of the women in peacekeeping. That's why the Indonesian delegations come up with the initiative to table that particular issues as our draft resolution in the UN Security Council, and it was what you call adopted by consensus, even supported and co-sponsored by more than 90 countries. So it means the strong support are there. Of course, later on, maybe the question about how to utilize that particular support, the overwhelming support, into a more concrete actions, and not to stop only at the level of political support. Although at the same time, maybe it is not harmful in terms of for those countries who are in a position to do so, maybe can do more. Try to, let's say, to provide some kind of training, capacity building to other countries who are still maybe lacking in resources, in expanding or implementing the role of peacekeepers in their national planning and so on. So it's all about how we can try to work in parallel as a team with different stakeholders, with different capacity and capability. I don't know whether it is going to be politically correct or not, but I think the issue of this kind of role of women, peace, and security should be, I think, addressed in the UNFCCC spirit, a common but differentiated responsibility with respective capability. So, I mean, we need to work in accordance with our contribution, our role in the concept itself. Hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Roy. I think you've highlighted there that there are many aspects to the implementation of women, peace, and security as it relates to peace operations that need to be considered and factored in, that are integral, I think, to the work that peacekeepers are doing. We've had another question come in relation to the use of data-driven and evidence-based decision-making. And I might direct this question to you, Cedric. And the individual is asking about the mechanisms that can be utilised in terms of monitoring, I should say, different missions at different stages. So how do we utilise some of the data that's coming out of peace operations at the moment to ensure that missions are actually delivering on what they're deployed to do?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Farid Sarif, for that question. I think there was 3 recommendations that coming out of the Challenges Forum meeting that really speaks to this question. And the one relates, of course, to the enhanced use of digital technologies and data to make peace operations more adaptive. And I think there is a shift underway that we can see in peace operations to engage much more with data and to enhance the way the peace operations have been generating and analyzing and using data, both in the form of situational awareness, but also at the level of analysis. So the degree to which the joint mission analysis cells and other parts and tools and instruments of missions are using data, I would say is much more advanced now than it has been just a few years ago. And this also is reflected through CPAS, as David mentioned. But I think there's of course still a lot of room to improve that. This is a part of the work that is continually changing and developing, and so the UN will have to continuously adapt and improve and enhance the way it engages with data. And the whole mobile dimension and the way that can be a way of also engaging and making UN peace operations more people-centered, as was mentioned, I think is very important. But there's two other points that I might want to, or two other recommendations that I just want to quickly mention as well, that I think is important here. The one is that we focus a lot naturally on the peace operations itself, but one of the important findings, I think, coming out of the work of the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network is that one of the major dimensions that influence the effectiveness of peace operations is the degree to which member states and key regional stakeholders are supporting politically a particular mission, the degree to which there's a coherent international political support for a mission, and therefore also for the dimensions that is generated by the data and the analysis is critical. So I think we need to not just look at the missions, but also look at how does this information filter through to the level of, for instance, the Security Council, and how can one use that to make sure that the Security Council is more coherent and in its support for particular missions, especially going through difficult transitions. And then the last one I want to mention is the fact that we are now operating in much more of a networked type of peace operations where we have multiple operations in the same theater. So if we look at Sahel or Mali, for instance, we know that we have the UN, but we also have the G5 Sahel Force, we have the African Union, we have the European Union, we have the French bilateral engagement and various other stakeholders also in the broader development and economic dimension. And so we shouldn't look just narrowly at the UN peacekeeping operation, but we should ask, how can we make an assessment of this broader international effort in whether it's Somalia or Mali, or whether it's the Congo or Central African Republic or South Sudan or other areas. And so it's important to also think in this broader realm of how can we use data and how can we use digital technologies to improve coherence about this overall international effort. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cedric. We've had a number of excellent questions come in, so I will quickly defer to our panelists. We have had one come in relation to organised crime and transnational organised crime as being something that UN military and police contributors to UN missions have to address in terms of, I guess, their operations on the ground in mission environments. I might throw this question to you, David, in terms of some of the work that the UN is doing at the moment, or UN peace operations around transnational organised crime. And then very quickly to Roy, I understand we'll also have a few responses on this. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I agree with the premise of the question that the balance between military and police is important, and particularly if a country is transitioning out of immediate aftermath of conflict and looking at building institutions and creating safety for the population. This question is a big challenge, because very often in the empty spaces, ungoverned spaces that the conflict has opened up, there's room and space for transnational organized crime, particularly linked often to natural resources, human trafficking, etc. And of course, peacekeeping and peace operations are somewhat at a limitation, because they're very often mandated by the Security Council, directly looking within the borders of one country. And transnational crime therefore has an advantage, because it's working regionally and internationally. And so I think making sure that we're well linked up to REX, as has been said, and other regional initiatives, Interpol and other international institutions, working with other UN partners such as UNODC, are key parts of addressing this. it also is important because it links to the challenges we've been talking about around assuring a coherent political strategy. Because when the purveyors of violence are not actually engaged in violence in order to achieve a political end, but simply to continue a criminal enterprise, then the toolbox that the UN offers, let's say, come to the peace table, agree on disarmament, merge your forces into a national army, and take part in government as a civilian political actor, is not actually what some of those purveyors of violence are interested in. And therefore, one needs to think about a much more regional and international approach to begin to starve them of their motivation and opportunity for engagement. And so I think more police is certainly part of it, but I think also more specialized assistance and some of these other tools coming to bear is important as well. And I think from the Security Council, bringing their bilateral strength and regional actors' strength bilaterally as police actors and as intelligence actors is crucial to address this challenge. So I think those are aspects which are, let's say, outside the normal peace and security toolbox of peacekeeping that need to be brought to bear. And so partnerships becomes really critical here, and analysis to understand the context and understand when you're applying the wrong tool to this particular challenge. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. And I'll throw very briefly to you, Roy. I know you had a quick response on that question. And I think we've got one final question that I'll direct to Fonteh before we wrap up. So over to you, Roy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Very briefly, I echo everything that David mentioned, especially with regard to the necessity to work in tandem with regard to all UN agencies in order not to overlapping, so they have their own expertise and their own field. Maybe one additional thing from me is about we need always to make sure that we consider the whole spectrum, the whole peace continuum spectrum at the same time, the peacemaking, peace building, the peacekeeping, peace building, and even the sustainable development. So it means when we are talking about that kind of continuum spectrum, we know that maybe we do not have to do everything by ourselves. Maybe our work will be the stepping stone for other actors who will come later on in the peace process. So it's all about a sharing burden, not burden shifting, of course. And in this regard, the work with the importance of the UN Security Council always working closely with the PBC is a must. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about how we make sure that nothing will practically repeat it again. No countries will relapse into conflict just because the miscommunication between the council, maybe not miscommunication, but reluctance here in very open and frank discussion between the council and BBC. That's it. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you, Roy. Some very important points there in terms of the wider bodies that need to be engaged in those processes that are really important. So I think we just have time for one final question that I'll direct to you, Fonteh, and this is related to the role of the AU observer mission in New York in terms of engaging, or the A3's contribution perhaps to some of the discussions around peace operations. And also we've got a question there about why so little attention is given to the enhancement of African Union peace operations in terms of the role of them in preventing and mitigating conflict. So I might direct that question to you before we wrap up the conversation here.
Thanks, Lisa, and excellent questions as well. Rather than focusing on the reason why the AU voice is not centralized at the UN Security Council, I think it would be useful to actually move towards what can be done to amplify the African voices in the UN Security Council. The first, I think, is in strengthening partnerships between the AU and the UN, including the regional economic communities, which we had alluded to before. Because in fact, Africa still moves with the mantra of African solutions to African problems. And if we are trying to connect bottom-up approaches from top-down approaches as well, and linking different skills of engagement, it's imperative that we figure out exactly how to close blind spots and actually bring those who are most affected by the crisis to the table to discuss the solutions to this crisis as well. So that's the first thing. The second is basically catering to the tensions between traditional peace operations and the allure of this new ad hoc security arrangements, which do not necessarily receive the full endorsement of the UN Security Council. If you look to the Sahel, for example, and the Lake Chad Basin, the Horn of Africa, we actually see festering crisis, partly because there isn't clear alignment between, say, the G5 Sahel, which is an ad hoc arrangement, and the UN Security Council as well, passing through the African Union. Looking at this blind spot, it definitely puts the spotlight on the AU observer mission in New York, because the AU observer mission in New York has the capacity to mobilize not only the members, diplomatic missions from the AU PSC members who are based in New York to address these issues, but it also has the capacity to mobilize think tanks and civil society actors to bring their voices to support peace operations as well. So I think there's a lot of potential within the AU observer mission in New York, which they would be able to harness if they were given the right seat at the table and the right support from the UN actors as well.
Thank you very much, Fonteh. I think that's a really important note to conclude on. I'm not necessarily going to do justice to all the issues that were covered in sort of the last 40 minutes of the conversation, but I think one of the key themes that sort of echoes across the issues that have been discussed is undoubtedly partnerships. You know, partnerships in terms of the work that peace operations do with engaging with local actors, partnerships in terms of the work that the A3 and members of the AU Peace and Security Council, for instance, engage with other member states in New York, as well as the UN, and similarly partnerships as it comes to sort of research and data on peace operations and how they can be fed into different processes that happen around decision-making and mandating and looking at effectiveness. So it's been a really comprehensive discussion. I would like to thank our panelists for taking part in the conversation today, and also to the participants. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get through all the excellent questions that have been sent through, but I think it highlights the fact that this is an ongoing dialogue and there's a lot of interest in terms of where we see peace operations moving forward beyond the discussions that we had last year at the Virtual Challenges Forum. So moving on next, I understand we're going to have a few remarks from the Acting Director of the Challenges International Former Secretariat, Lisa Arrhenius. So I will hand over the floor to her now to provide us with some remarks to wrap up the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Benoit, for steering the conversation very effectively over 1 hour. Yes, so it's left to me just to do a quick thank you, and just adding on to what Lisa just said. Really a warm thank you from all of us at the Challenges Forum Secretariat. First of all, to Norway and Indonesia for hosting the launch of the report to the diplomatic community in New York. This is a Challenges Forum tradition, and we are very grateful that we continue doing this, even if virtually. And really also a warm thank you to the panelists, of course, our friends in ISS South Africa, and NUPI, Norway, and MFA in Indonesia, who also co-hosted the annual forum last December. And as well, big thank you to you and DPO as well. Shaping the debate is Challenges Forum's tagline, and with our annual forum and other expert meetings like this, we hope that we help doing just that. And I think the conversation today is definitely sort of, we discuss a lot. Often we come back to sort of the same issues, but I see some shaping being done. So I take some comfort in that. And we really hope that the recommendations that we have specifically discussed today will contribute to our collective efforts for effective peace operations, and that they inspire further discussions, priority setting, and decisions in the Security Council, in the PVC, and in other relevant fora. I wanted to note that we asked participants, we asked all of you when you registered for this event about your knowledge about the recommendations, and 50% of the registrants indicated that they knew of the recommendations, and 30% said that they used them in the daily work, which we were quite happy with those numbers. And it would be interesting to do the same sort of a checkout survey. Hopefully they would have increased even more after this event. Just to remind you also, if you're interested, the full report and the recommendations are available online on our website.